The news that a decades-old murder case has finally been solved in Ontario has made headlines, and the police have been congratulated for finally finding the man who they say killed 9-year-old Christine Jessop. But it raises all kinds of questions, too. Why did it take 36 years? Why was a neighbor of the Jessops wrongly accused and convicted? And why did police overlook the real killer? Jessop's family has spent decades living with grief and uncertainty.
A 9-year-old girl stepped off her school bus, walked home, opened the front door, and placed her backpack in the kitchen. No one would ever see her alive again. When her mother and brother returned about an hour later, the house was completely empty. But 3 details immediately made them feel that something was wrong. The family dog was restless and agitated, as though something had happened to frighten it. The girl's bicycle was lying on its side inside the garage, and her coat had been hung on a hook that was far too high for her to reach on her own. Someone had been inside that house after she came home. Queensville, Ontario, Canada, October 3rd, 1984. What happened next would become one of the most serious miscarriages of justice in Canadian history. A case that destroyed 2 lives because of a single crime. The life of a little girl and the life of a completely innocent man who spent years paying for a crime he did not commit. Because the police chose a suspect, and once they chose him, they stopped looking in every other direction. Years later, an official commission of inquiry described what had happened using these exact words.
Utilizing the flawed science and that in conjunction with the identification of a person of interest at the time, they kind of had some tunnel vision in that they believed that they were after the right person and their attention was focused on that person because, to be clear, everyone wanted this case solved and with the right person in custody.
They convicted the man, sentenced him to life in prison, and were wrong from beginning to end. Meanwhile, the real killer remained free. And the most disturbing part of this story was where he had been all along. He was not a complete stranger. He was not someone who had simply happened to pass by. He was someone the girl's family knew, someone they had hugged, someone who had sat at their dinner table, someone who helped search for the missing child and remained close to the family throughout the investigation. For 36 years, that man carried a familiar face, yet his name never appeared in the case file. Until science, using technology that existed only in the realm of imagination in 1984, revealed 2 truths that had remained hidden for nearly 4 decades. The man who had been convicted was completely innocent, and the real killer had been standing in plain sight the entire time. The girl's name was Christine Jessop. She was only 9 years old. And this is the story of how the justice system failed in almost every possible way, and how the truth eventually found its way into the light. Christine Jessop was 9 years old and lived in Queensville, a small rural community north of Toronto. It was the kind of place where children could walk home from school alone without anyone worrying. The houses were separated by open fields. The roads were quiet. Neighbors recognized one another. It was a place where almost nothing ever seemed to happen. The kind of place many parents would consider one of the safest places in the world to raise a child. Christine was an ordinary 9-year-old girl. She went to school, had an older brother named Kenny, and lived with her mother, Janet. They were a normal family living in a normal town. On Wednesday, October 3rd, 1984, Christine returned home from school just as she did on any other day. Her school bus dropped her off near the family's house that afternoon. No one was waiting for her. Her mother had taken Kenny to a dentist appointment, and they expected to return home shortly afterward. Christine would be alone in the house for only a short time. For a 9-year-old growing up in a town like Queensville, that did not seem unusual. Christine entered the house and placed her backpack in the kitchen. We know for certain that she made it home, because the evidence of her arrival was still there. Christine had definitely stepped inside, but at some point during the 1-hour window between Christine's arrival and her family's return, someone else entered that house. When Janet and Kenny came home, Christine was gone. At first, her absence was not necessarily alarming. A child who was not at home might simply have gone outside to play, ridden her bicycle around the neighborhood, or visited a friend. Things like that happened every day, but certain details did not make sense. The family dog was agitated, restless, and anxious, as though something frightening had happened while no one else was home. Christine's bicycle was lying on its side inside the garage. It was the bicycle Christine normally used to get around town, but now it was lying abandoned on the garage floor. And then there was the coat. Christine's coat had been hung on a hook, but it was a very high hook. Too high for a 9-year-old girl to reach on her own. Someone taller had placed it there. That small but chilling detail suggested something very specific. An adult had been inside the house. Someone tall enough to reach the coat hook. Someone who had been there with Christine during the roughly 1 hour she was home alone. The house was telling a story without saying a single word. A little girl had made it home safely. An adult arrived afterward. And then she disappeared, without anyone hearing so much as a scream. Janet began searching for her daughter.
If I do see something, I stop and look.
She spoke to neighbors, traveled around town, and when the search produced nothing, she called the police. 9-year-old Christine Jessop had vanished from her own home in broad daylight, in a place once considered one of the safest towns in the world. The search for Christine Jessop began immediately and on a massive scale. Police officers, neighbors, and volunteers from across the region searched the surrounding fields, forests, and roads.
Okay, everybody start forward, please. Very slowly, and don't leave any gaps.
You could see them searching across the fields, for miles. They searched different areas. We went out and searched. That went on for 3 months.
An entire town mobilized to find a 9-year-old girl who had disappeared from her own home, but they did not find her. Days passed, then weeks. October became November. November became December. Christine still had not been found. For a family, few forms of suffering last longer than not knowing what happened. They could not fully grieve. They did not know where to search. There was nothing they could do except wait for news that never came. On New Year's Eve, December 31st, 1984, nearly 3 months after Christine disappeared, the news finally came in the worst possible way. A man searching for his dog in a wooded area near Sunderland discovered the remains of a young girl. The location was approximately 35 miles from Christine's home. It was a considerable distance, far enough that no one had thought to search for her there. The person who abducted Christine had not left her close to home. He had driven her a long distance and abandoned her in a remote area where it took months for anyone to find her. It was Christine. Christine was only 9 years old, and she deserves to be treated with dignity rather than having her death turned into a spectacle. What matters is that she had been sexually assaulted and murdered. It was a brutal crime committed against a completely defenseless child. But amid all of that horror, one piece of evidence remained evidence that would eventually transform the entire case decades later. A semen sample was recovered from Christine's clothing. In 1984, that sample was almost useless. DNA testing as we understand it today did not yet exist. Scientists could identify only a few basic characteristics from bodily fluids. But they could not do the one thing that truly mattered. They could not identify one specific person. They could not produce the name and face of the man who had left that evidence behind. So the sample was preserved and placed in evidence storage. No one could yet read the information contained inside it. No one knew that the name of Christine Jessop's killer was already written within that sample. His identity was encoded in a language that science had not yet learned how to decipher. It would take 36 years before anyone could finally read it. While that sample remained in storage, waiting for science to advance far enough to unlock its secrets, the investigation needed someone to hold responsible. Immediately, a community had been shaken. A little girl had been murdered, and the pressure on police to solve the case was enormous. That pressure led investigators to focus their attention on one man. Not because of evidence, not because of a solid lead, but because they felt there was something unusual about him. The man police began investigating was Paul Morin. He was 24 years old. Morin lived with his parents in the house next door to the Jessop family. He was their neighbor. No one had seen him with Christine. There was no physical evidence connecting him to her. Police focused on him because they believed he seemed strange. Paul Morin was quiet, introverted, and solitary. He worked sanding furniture at a manufacturing plant. He played the clarinet and kept bees as a hobby. Morin was simply a private person with uncommon interests who had chosen to live life in his own way. One investigator even wrote in the case file that Morin was a strange person. In essence, that became the foundation for everything that followed. Morin was considered odd. There were also a few other details that, to a police force already convinced that he was the man they should be watching, appeared to strengthen their suspicions. Morin had not actively participated in the searches for Christine. He had also not attended her funeral. To anyone who understands introverted people, neither of those things necessarily meant anything. Some people simply do not know how to behave in the face of tragedy. Some avoid funerals because they cannot bear to witness the pain of others. Some withdraw instead of moving closer. Being quiet, living alone, and avoiding crowds does not make someone a child murderer. But the police saw it differently. They saw an unusual neighbor, a man who did not cry in front of others, a man who did not publicly join in the town's collective grief. And they decided that he was the one who had murdered Christine. And this was the moment the case became a perfect example of one of the most dangerous mistakes that can occur during an investigation. It is known as tunnel vision. Tunnel vision occurs when investigators decide too early who they believe the perpetrator is. From that moment forward, they are no longer investigating the crime. Instead, they begin building a case against the person they have already chosen. Every fact that supports their theory is exaggerated. Every fact that contradicts it is ignored, minimized, or explained away until it is no longer an obstacle. The mind stops searching for the truth. It begins searching for confirmation. The police also faced another serious problem. Morin's work records made it extremely difficult for him to have had enough time to commit the crime. The timeline did not fit. So what did they do? Instead of allowing that problem to make them question their theory, they adjusted the timeline of the crime to make it fit Morin. They shifted each piece until their theory could work. That is exactly how tunnel vision operates. This was no longer a search for the person who had actually committed the crime. It had become an effort to distort reality until everything pointed toward the man the police had already chosen. And once the machinery of the justice system began moving against Guy Paul Morin, stopping it became almost impossible. Guy Paul Morin was arrested and charged with the murder of Christine Jessop. The case became even more unjust because Morin was not tried only once. He was tried twice. At his first trial in 1986, the jury found Morin not guilty. He was acquitted. During that first trial, the justice system did not find enough evidence to convict him, but the prosecution refused to accept the result. They appealed the acquittal and achieved something that would be almost unimaginable in many countries: a second trial for the same crime. At the second trial in 1992, the outcome was completely different. Guy Paul Morin was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. The same man, the same crime, almost the same body of evidence. Not guilty at the first trial, but guilty at the next. So what was that conviction based on? There was no direct evidence. There was no eyewitness who had seen the crime take place. What persuaded a jury to send this man to prison for the rest of his life? There were three main factors. And today, we know that all three were worthless. The first was hair and fiber comparison evidence. Scientists claimed that fibers found in Morin's car or home matched fibers associated with Christine. It sounded highly technical. It sounded extremely convincing. But the method itself, microscopic hair and fiber comparison, was later shown to be deeply unreliable. Years afterward, an official inquiry concluded that this type of evidence was, in its own words, essentially worthless. But there was something even worse. At the forensic laboratory, fibers from Christine's clothing and fibers from Morin's car had been cross-contaminated. They had been mixed together. Two scientists knew that the contamination had occurred, but they failed to disclose it. Evidence that could have helped prove Morin's innocence was simply concealed. The second factor involved jailhouse informants. Two men who had been incarcerated with Morin claimed that he had confessed the crime to them. They said Morin had told them the truth while they were in jail together. Jailhouse informants are among the most dangerous sources of evidence in the justice system. They almost always provide testimony in exchange for something: a reduced sentence, a privilege, or a favorable deal. They have every reason to invent a story, and in this case, one of the two informants later admitted under oath that he had fabricated the entire account. Morin had never confessed anything to him. The man had lied in order to gain benefits for himself. The third factor was the belief that Morin behaved like a guilty person. His unusual personality, the way he spoke, his reactions, none of those things were evidence of anything. But when presented to a jury that had already been guided toward a particular conclusion, they began to carry weight. The hair and fiber evidence was worthless. One informant had lied, and the rest came down to the perceived oddness of an introverted man. With only that, the government of Ontario sent Guy Paul Morin to prison with a life sentence. He spent 18 months behind bars for a crime he had not committed, and for nearly 10 years, he lived beneath the shadow of the accusation. He was condemned, insulted, hunted, and known across Canada as the man who had murdered a 9-year-old girl. Meanwhile, sitting silently in an evidence storage room was the semen sample that no jury had ever truly understood, a sample that held the truth. In 1995, everything changed. DNA technology had advanced far enough to accomplish what had been impossible in 1984. Experts were finally able to analyze the semen sample preserved on Christine's clothing and compare it with a specific individual. They compared the DNA profile with Guy Paul Morin. It was not a match. The DNA of the man who sexually assaulted and murdered Christine Jessop did not belong to Morin. It was not even close. Science, with a level of certainty that no jury could dispute, had finally stated what a decade of tunnel vision had refused to recognize. Morin was innocent. On January 23, 1995, Guy Paul Morin was formally and completely acquitted, exonerated, released, and finally recognized under the law as an innocent man. The Canadian government awarded him $1,250,000 in compensation. A public inquiry known as the Kaufman Commission was also established to determine how the entire justice system had failed so catastrophically. It was that commission that used the phrase that perfectly summarized the case. Police and prosecutors had acted with tunnel vision of an extraordinary nature. It was an official government document acknowledging that the system had destroyed the life of an innocent man. But Morin's exoneration left behind one enormous and terrifying question. If Morin had not killed Christine, then who had? The real killer's DNA still existed. It was contained within that preserved sample. But a DNA profile by itself has limited value when there is no other sample available for comparison. Police searched for a match in criminal DNA databases. There was none. Over the years, investigators examined more than 300 suspects. Not one of them matched the DNA. By 1998, after every lead had reached a dead end, the renewed investigation was officially closed. Christine's killer still had no name, and it seemed the case might remain that way forever, until a new technology emerged. It was the same technology used in 2018 to identify the Golden State Killer, one of the most wanted serial killers in the United States. That technology is known as genetic genealogy. Genetic genealogy works differently from traditional DNA matching. Instead of searching for an exact match to the suspect, it searches for the suspect's relatives. Experts compare the DNA profile with public databases on websites where millions of people voluntarily upload their genetic information to learn more about their family origins. It does not directly search for the killer. It searches for cousins, distant relatives, whom the killer himself may not even know exist. Using those partial matches, genealogists begin reconstructing entire family trees, one generation at a time, one branch at a time, until the circle gradually closes around a single person. In 2020, a team of forensic genealogists took the DNA profile from the Christine Jessop case, the sample that had been preserved for 36 years, and began building that family tree, branch by branch, name by name, blood relationship by blood relationship. The family tree gradually narrowed until it led to one man. His name was Calvin Hoover, and when police saw that name, they recognized a truth that sent a chill through everyone involved. He was not a stranger. Calvin Hoover was a friend of the Jessop family. On October 15, 2020, Toronto police held a press conference. 36 years after Christine Jessop stepped off her school bus, they publicly announced the name of her killer, Calvin Hoover. The police chief made a statement that left no room for doubt. If Calvin Hoover were alive today, we would arrest him for the murder of Christine Jessop, because this time, he was no longer merely a suspect. His identity had been established. The DNA evidence was conclusive. And this was what made the case especially haunting. When police reconstructed Calvin Hoover's connection to the family, they discovered that he had been standing in plain sight the entire time. Hoover was 28 years old when Christine was murdered. He was not a stranger. He was a friend of the Jessop family. He knew Christine's father and regularly visited their home. Hoover was a familiar face, someone who had been accepted and trusted within the family's life. While police pursued guy Paul Morin simply because he was an unusual neighbor who kept bees, the real killer was a family friend. Someone who could enter that house without raising suspicion. Someone the family trusted. Someone Christine almost certainly knew and had no reason to fear. And that explains the most disturbing detail in the entire story. The coat hanging from a hook that was too high for her to reach. An adult had been inside the house. A little girl had not screamed. She had not run away. She had not sensed any immediate danger. Because the person who entered was not a frightening stranger. He had a familiar face. Calvin Hoover died by suicide in 2015, 5 years before his name was publicly revealed. He never knew that distant relatives who uploaded their DNA to a genealogy website would eventually and indirectly lead investigators to him. Hoover never had to answer for what he had done. There was no trial. There was no longer anyone alive to prosecute. Investigators located a sample of Hoover's blood that had been preserved following his autopsy in 2015. They compared that blood sample with the DNA recovered from Christine's clothing. It was a complete match. And when the case was finally solved, the person who had waited the longest for that moment was not a police officer, nor was it one of the victim's relatives. It was guy Paul Morin, the innocent man, the man who had spent 18 months in prison and nearly 10 years living under the label of a child murderer. When Morin heard the news, he said something that was impossible to forget. He explained that when DNA cleared his name in 1995, he had always believed that one day the same kind of evidence would identify the real killer. And finally, it had. Morin also said something that revealed the kind of person he truly was. The man who had been called a monster for years said that he felt relieved for Christine's mother, Janet, and for the entire Jessop family. He hoped the discovery would bring them some measure of peace. A man whose life had been devastated by the case was still thinking about how the victim's family might finally find comfort. This case ended with an unbearable weight. A 9-year-old girl was murdered by someone her family trusted. An innocent man's life was destroyed because the police believed he was strange. The real killer remained free for another 31 years after the crime. He stayed close to the community, remained unsuspected, and ultimately took many unanswered questions with him to the grave. Because one question may never be answered. What else did Calvin Hoover do during those 31 years? A person capable of committing such a crime and then living freely for another 3 decades is rarely assumed to have acted only once. Above all, the case leaves behind a warning about tunnel vision, about what happens when investigators decide too early who the perpetrator must be. Years are wasted, innocent lives are destroyed, and the person who is truly responsible is given more time. Sometimes, all the time in the world. Police focused on the quiet, unusual man living next door, but they failed to look closely at the trusted friend who had once sat at the family's dinner table. Her name was Christine Jessop. She was only 9 years old. One afternoon in October, Christine came home from school, placed her backpack in the kitchen, and trusted the wrong person. It took 36 years before her name could finally be placed beside the name of the man who murdered her. But in the end, the truth was finally revealed. The Christine Jessop case reminds us that justice cannot be built on prejudice or on pressure to identify a suspect as quickly as possible. A person who is different, quiet, or socially withdrawn is not automatically guilty. Every investigation must respect the evidence, remain objective, and continue considering alternative possibilities. Adults must also teach children to maintain safe boundaries, even around people they know. The truth may arrive late, but society still has a responsibility to search for it. correct injustice, protect the innocent, and do everything possible to prevent the same tragedy from happening again.